Talk Speedway. Talk Speedway.
Hello and welcome to the Talk Speedway podcast. I'm Scott Frame, and joining me and my co-host Graham Munsey on the third of our Featurecast series is world-renowned Speedway photographer and Back the Bees campaigner Jeff Davies. Jeff, welcome to Talk Speedway podcast.
My pleasure, Scott.
Jeff, we're absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast, obviously, to talk about a subject we know it's actually really close to your heart. Coventry Speedway obviously runs in your blood. We can see that through social media and obviously the campaigning and you do for the Back the Bees campaign. But let me take you back to last winter. Coventry's team building was well and truly underway, and then came the announcement that the Bees wouldn't take to the track. Was that something that you knew was coming, or did it just come as a complete shock to everyone?
I knew it was coming, basically, because I'd been involved with a small team trying to make things work to run the Bees at Leicester. So when Mr. Horton was trying to get a team together and run at Leicester in what was the Elite League this season, we were trying to help, and it was pretty clear that we were really struggling to make that work at Leicester, and for a couple of reasons. One was that sponsors had dropped out. Two, Mr. Horton couldn't get an agreement to run at Leicester for the whole season. We thought and hoped at one stage that we may be able to start the season at Leicester and then midway through the season get back to Brandon, but that wasn't the point, and that wasn't achieved in the end. So it came as no surprise, frankly, when the BSPA said that we could not run this year. I could understand it. It was difficult to accept, but it was the right thing for them to do, because had Coventry started the league, they very well may not have finished it, and Speedway could do without teams dropping out mid-season. So it was very unfortunate, very sad for me and many other people, but ultimately it was the right thing to do.
And for any of our listeners who maybe aren't Coventry fans or aren't overly familiar with the situation, what was it that brought about that decision, that kind of from the team looking like it was ready to go to, wait a minute, we need to put a plan B in place here, and then eventually the Bees not taken to the track at all?
Well, I think most people know that the stadium was sold. It was sold a couple of years ago, in actual fact, even though they continued to run. It was sold in 2013. And there was a long saga of difficulties between Mr. Sandu and Mr. Horton, and in November, December time, we were all hoping that they could come to an agreement and that they would be able to run both Speedway and stock car at Brandon this year. And 3 times a deal was agreed, but 3 times the contract was not signed by Mr. Horton, so for whatever reason. And when the contract wasn't signed, Mr. Sandu was removing some of the assets. Each time they thought they got an agreement, they stopped work on removing assets, and each time he failed to sign it, they continued to remove assets. So the stadium was not in a position to run Speedway. The lights, the seats, many of the things, the fence, etc., had all been taken out. However, had the deal been signed between Mr. Horton and Mr. Sandu, then Mr. Sandu was prepared to reinstate all of those assets at his own cost, which was estimated to be £150,000. But unfortunately, the contract was not signed, and Mr. Horton returned the lease to Brandon Estates. Brandon Estates being the new owners, of course, of the stadium. So it wasn't to be. For whatever reason, Mr. Horton didn't sign the contract, and therefore the team didn't have a stadium to run in.
Jeff, the situation that Coventry obviously found ourselves in with kind of Mick Horton and the Brandon Estates, is it a case of kind of mismanagement there, or is it maybe something a wee bit deeper than that?
Well, it was initially, after the stadium was sold, Mr. Horton went to Brandon Estates and he struck a deal with Brandon Estates to run Speedway.
Yep.
For this year, and they were prepared to allow him to run Speedway. They were even prepared to give him a very substantial sum of money to do that. It's no secret that it was £50,000 he would have got from Brandon Estates to run this year, and had Brandon Estates got their plans to build houses on the stadium onto the rugby local plan, he would have got another £190,000 over the next few years. But it didn't work out. They couldn't sign a contract. They couldn't reach agreement between Mr. Horton and Mr. Sandu, as I've already said, and it was very clear that you can't run Speedway on its own in a big stadium like Coventry without support. And Speedway Brandon needs both sports to run to make it viable. So
Jeff, they're quite substantial amounts of money you're kind of talking about there, and obviously you've said a couple of times that maybe Mr. Horton hasn't signed the deal. Is there any particular reason that you've been made aware of why the deal hadn't been signed? I mean, is there a particular reason there that Mick Horton didn't sign the deal?
He's told me a couple of times why he didn't sign a deal, but it's not something really that helps us. To be honest, going into all the background to it, the stadium is not available, and as the expression goes, we are where we are. So we have to look forward. And when it happened, and I got a phone call from Buster Chapman in February one morning. I was out walking my dog very early, as I do every day, 7:30, and I got a phone call from Buster to tell me that Coventry were not going to be allowed to race. 10 minutes later, I got a phone call from the local radio station, and it sort of snowballed from there. And right from the start, when we formed a committee, we said that there is little point in talking about what's gone on, who's created this problem, why we're in the position we're in. There's little value in doing that, because we are where we are, and we have to look forward and see what we can do to try and recover from that situation. That was the very first meeting we had with the committee. That was an agreement we made that there is no point in looking back. There's no point in talking about it. I can understand everybody wanted to know what had gone on, who they could blame, etc. But it doesn't help us move things forward.
Yep.
So,
yep. And that probably leads quite nicely actually into the next question. What is the current situation? What is an update on where it stands at the moment?
Well, where it stands at the moment is, of course, that the developers, Brandon Estates, a man called John Downer who lives in Monaco. His business is registered in Jersey, so it's pretty secretive. You can't find out too much about it. But they are planning to build houses on it. They want to build houses on it. Now, their original plan was to build 250 houses on the site. They presented that 2 years ago in Binley Woods Village Hall, local to the stadium. And there was a lot of opposition to it, as you can imagine. They subsequently changed their plan, and just 5 or 6 weeks ago, they put on an exhibition to show that their plans have been amended to build 137 houses now on the site. At the moment, their planning application has not been submitted. So, and it's not on the local plan. So just to explain the process, the local plan, every town, every city has to submit a plan to the government every 5 years. And it basically shows on that plan what their development plans are for housing, etc., in the foreseeable future. If you're on that plan, if a development is shown on that plan, they're pretty much certain of getting that development passed, approved. But the development of Brandon is not on Rugby's plan. So two things are happening. Brandon Estates they're going to challenge that plan. So the process, the local plan process, requires that after it's been submitted to the government, there is a review of that plan, a public examination it's called, where people who have an interest in it are able to comment and to challenge it effectively. So Brandon Estates intend to challenge the plan, and that challenge will be starting in January, next month in fact now. So that's the first thing, they're challenging that plan. The second thing, they are expected to submit a speculative planning application. So they'll put in a plan for the 137 houses, presumably, that they displayed 5 or 6 weeks ago, and they'll see how they get on with the planning officers at Rugby Council. So those are the two things that are happening. We're waiting for the planning application to go in, and we've been advised of the dates now for the public examination. We will be present, of course. We've submitted what's called representations for that. So Save Coventry Speedway will be represented at that public examination, the town plan. So that's what's happening with the site itself. You may know, or you may have read or seen that the stadium has been very badly vandalised. Mm-hmm. So in the summer months there was 3 visits by gypsies, and on each of those visits they damaged the stadium. I would say that it was a third lot of gypsies that did the bulk of the damage. They went inside the stadium and they completely smashed it up. So all of the windows throughout the stadium are smashed. You know, the big panoramic grandstand windows and all the windows to the offices, the shops, the outbuildings. They've all been smashed, and inside all the offices and the bars and restaurants, etc., have been vandalised. So it's a very, very sad site. Brandon Estates claim that in their planning application, or their representations in their challenge to the planning application, claim that the stadium is dilapidated. They claim it was as a result of the actions of the previous leasee, i.e. Mr. Sandu, which is absolutely nonsense. Mm-hmm. Because the day that Mr. Sandu vacated the site, which was the 31st of December 2016, so just about a year ago, he asked me to go to the stadium and take pictures. And I took pictures throughout the stadium, inside out, all the offices, all the bars, restaurants, everywhere. I've got a collection of pictures which show that whilst the stadium, some of the assets have been removed, as I was just talking about a few minutes ago, the stadium was left in a clean and tidy state. So to claim that the stadium is dilapidated as a result of those actions is nonsense. If it's dilapidated, it's as a result of Brandon Estates' failure to secure the site and allow gypsies to get in there on 3 occasions. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Rugby Council recognised that fact because they actually served a notice on the owners, Brandon Estates, to tell them that they had X number of days to tidy up the mess and to make the site secure. So that's what happened that's the situation at the stadium. We're waiting for the planning application to go in. The stadium is badly damaged, though it is largely superficial. We think if we ever got back in there, we can put all that right. As far as the team is concerned and Coventry Bees, I'm sure people listening to this podcast will know that Mr. Horton is applying to join the National League and race the team at Leicester.
Yeah.
And maybe just touching back on the planning side of things, again, Jeff, is there anything as an outsider to Coventry or as a Speedway fan people can do? Is there councillors that can be written to expressing how people would visit Coventry based on the Bees being back in it, Brandon? Is there anything we can do as Speedway fans to help move that along or help get the Bees heard?
There is indeed. What we have been doing as a campaign group is to make people aware of what's going on, make them aware of the planning process. So I referred a few minutes ago to a public examination, to a exhibition that was held in a local hotel where the Brandon Estates showed the plans of what they want to do. So they booked a suite at the hotel, and they held this exhibition. As soon as we found out about it, we went to the same hotel and asked them, could we hire a room or a collection of rooms? We were upfront and told them what we wanted to do. We were opposed to what the developers were doing, and we wanted to put a counter argument. So we hired a room. We put a lot of display material up to give people information. The hotel, the Brandon Hall Hotel, were really good. They allowed us to put a stock car right outside the front doors, a speedway bike inside the hotel, and we had several hundred visitors attend that day. So we were making people aware, predominantly local residents, but speedway and stock car fans as well. We were making them aware of what our objections were, why we believe it should stay, etc. We subsequently posted, hand-delivered, I should say, 1,000 letters to residents in Brandon Village, in Binley Woods Village, so that local villages around the stadium, explaining to people what's happening, what's going on, making them aware of the planning process, and we told them that as soon as the planning application goes in, we will write to them again. So we'll write to all of the residents again, 95% of which, by the way, are opposed to the redevelopment of the stadium. Really? They want the stadium to remain. So we will notify them when the planning application's gone in. We'll let them know who they have to submit objections to, if indeed they object, and so who they've got to send it to, by what date, and we'll probably give them some indication of things they might wish to object to, some of the things that we think are unacceptable and what they might want to object to. So we've also got our website, Save Coventry Speedway website. As soon as we know the application is going in or has gone in, we will make people aware, and we'll ask speedway and stock car fans to make sensible objections to the plans.
As you can imagine, Jeff, this is a pretty hot topic. There's a lot of fans wanting to ask a lot of questions, and we did put out in our social media for fans to get involved in our fan zone. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a few of the fans' questions.
The Fan Zone. Talk Speedway. Talk Speedway.
First up, we're going to take a question for Ross Bennett, who says he's not a Coventry fan, but what happens to the Coventry assets? Does the movement receive a loan fee, or does Horton own them? Would be great if loaning your riders could help you out as well.
Well, bear in mind that the focus of our group is trying to get Speedway back to Coventry and back to Brandon. But to the best of my knowledge, I'll try and answer that. So I think everybody knows Mr. Horton's licence was frozen last February, and once a licence is frozen, his assets are frozen. Any monies coming in through loan fees or transfers or whatever are also frozen. So monies are held by the BSPA. Mr. Horton does still own the club. He does still own a number of riders. If his licence is unfrozen, if he's successful in his application to join the National League, then he will be able to sell those riders or loan them to whoever. So so that's what will happen, and I'm sure people will know that the National League conference is this coming Thursday. So by this time on Thursday, we will know whether Mr. Horton's application has been accepted, whether he's met the requirements of Leicester in a contract to run at Leicester, and if he's met those contractual details, then is he going to be accepted by the other National League promoters? And the outcome of both of those questions should be answered on Thursday afternoon.
And that probably leads quite nicely to a question we had from Christopher Black on Facebook, who asked what your views were on the negative response to the club racing the National League at Leicester. In his view, surely keeping the club going is better than not running at all.
Well, on the face of it, you may well think so, but as far as the planning process is concerned, we believe if Coventry do race at Leicester, it will be very damaging to our campaign. And the reason for that is the developers are trying to prove a couple of things. They're trying to prove that running Speedway is not viable at Brandon. I think we would all accept if you're running Speedway on its own at Brandon, which is a big stadium, it's an old stadium, 89 years old, it is not viable just to run Speedway. But of course, since 1954, Brandon has stayed Speedway and stock car, and there's no doubt at all that if you run both sports, it is viable. So the view of Mr. Horton, he stated in his press release about trying to run a National League team at Leicester that I think the statement said a standalone operation at Brandon or anywhere else is not viable and never has been viable. Well, it was a very, very unhelpful thing to say, and it was it was completely out of context with the rest of his statement, and it seemed very much aligned to the argument that Brandon Estates are making. So, if Coventry were to run at Leicester in the National League, the developers can argue that Coventry is running elsewhere and there is no longer a need for the stadium. It's about whether there's an ongoing need for Brandon Stadium. They will argue that because Coventry are running elsewhere, and they may well, incidentally, be putting money into that. We are not certain of that, but we believe, given the fact that they were prepared to put in £50,000 earlier this year, and as I mentioned earlier, if they are putting money into the venture to run at Leicester, they can claim in their planning application that they're supporting Coventry Bees trying to help them run elsewhere, which will be well received, we imagine, by the planning officers. So by running at Leicester in the National League, it will not help our case to get a return of Speedway to Brandon. And on a personal note, I've been going there all of my life, and I'm now retired. I'm knocking on a bit. I've been going there since I was born. My parents went there. I've been the photographer there for 34 years. I've seen every year top flight speedway race there. I've seen world champions, Ollie Olsen, Greg Hancock, legends like Nigel Bucock. I could reel off dozens of them. Tommy Knudsen, Brian Anderson, Billy Hamill. There's loads of them. Top speedway riders.
It must give you goosebumps even saying those names though, Jeff, with the passion you've got for the club.
Exactly, yes. And for me personally, now I'm talking personally, now I'm not trying to dissuade people from going to Leicester if indeed they do run at Leicester. For me personally, it will not be Coventry Bees. Coventry Bees are a top flight club with, the world's best riders racing there. To run, with the greatest respect to young National League riders, running a National League team with young lads racing 30 miles away from home, for me it isn't Coventry Bees, but that's a personal view. What's more important is, again in Mr. Horton's statement, he said that a move to Leicester in the National League will secure the long-term future of Coventry Bees. Now, we still are trying to understand what that means. We don't understand what he means by it will secure a long-term future of Coventry Bees. We invited Mr. Horton and Neil Watson, his co-promoter, to one of our committee meetings, and we didn't get a reply. As it happens, I know that Mr. Horton is now in Australia. He's been in Australia for the last 2.5 weeks, and I don't think he's back until, for another week or two. So, but if we thought for one moment that there was a long-term plan, the first stage of which was to run a National League team at Leicester, then we would be more supportive of it. But we don't understand how running a team at Leicester in the National League can help secure the future of Coventry Bees long term, and certainly not in Coventry or Rugby area.
Yeah. The next question comes from Mark, another one who's not a Coventry fan, and he asks, how does the club go about having one group representing them and their future interests rather than two parties with different agendas potentially damaging the process?
Well, we are independent of both those other parties. I assume Mark means Mr. Horton and Mr. Sandhu.
Yeah.
We know that Mr. Sandhu had been trying to find an alternative site via Jeremy Heaver. They've not been successful. We don't know what Mr. Horton's done, frankly, to try and get a return to the Coventry area. We're working completely independent of those, and we, unlike anybody else, we've no vested interest. We're a group of ordinary people. There's 14 of us now. We've expanded the committee somewhat since it first was formed. There are 14 of us. We have no vested interest. We have no monies involved in any venture. We're not supporting one party or the other, i.e. Mr. Sandhu or Mr. Horton. We're simply trying to do our best by talking to all of the people that matter, the council leaders for Rugby, for Coventry, local MP. We've had numerous meetings and sent several hundred emails and had even more conversations. So we're doing everything we can to make it happen. And bring about a return to Coventry and Rugby, and that's what people want. That's what we all want. We don't want to be racing 30 miles away. We want to be racing ideally at Brandon. If it can't be Brandon, then somewhere local.
And you may have already sort of touched on it with some of the answer in that question there, Jeff. The last question from the fan zone comes from Matt Perkins, who asked that if the Save Coventry Speedway Group has backers, which confirm monies were in place for a new stadium, would the initial priority not to be to pay off Mr. Horton so that there was no connections with the club, so that everyone was then pulling in the same direction?
Well, Mr. Horton has changed his mind several times about what he wanted to do with the Coventry Bees. We all know that he paid £200,000 for it 5 or so years ago. I understand, and indeed looking at his accounts, you can see that money was repaid back over a number of years. He inherited a very healthy asset base at the time of riders, some of which is sold. I remember when earlier this year in February he attended the local supporters club, the Nuneaton Supporters Club meeting. To give him credit, he was brave enough to do it because it was a very, very hostile audience. But what he said is, at that meeting, that he was prepared to sell Coventry Bees to anybody who could move things forward. 2 weeks later, he changed his mind. He came out in the press and said, no, he's not going to sell it. It's unfinished business. So his intentions change. And at the moment, as we know, he's trying to run at Leicester. Mm-hmm. So if he was to sell it, well, what is it he's selling? Is he selling a number of riders? He's still got some assets, people like Chris Harris. We know he's sold a couple of them recently, but he's still got people like Chris Harris, Scott Nichols, Jason Garrity, Ben Barker, I think, are perhaps the names that spring to mind. So they have a certain value, but it's difficult to sell Coventry Bees when you don't really have anywhere to race. And what price would you put on it anyway when you've got nowhere to race? That's difficult. And if he doesn't want to sell it, as it appears he doesn't at the moment, then it's not a question.
It's going to be a moot point at that point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, we thank everybody once again for getting in touch. We've had some more questions that obviously we kind of ran out of time to kind of get to. Just one point on there, Steve Jones sent us a message quite late in the day before we started recording. You kind of covered his question, Jeff, but I'll just read out the end bit that you and the group for the Save Coventry Speedway campaign have been amazing this year. I think we kind of echo his thoughts there, but as I say, thank you to everyone who got in touch via social media. Of course, we are on Twitter at Talk Speedway, and of course on Facebook and Instagram on Talk Speedway Podcast. You can email the show at talkspeedwaypodcast@gmail.com, and you can check out our website talkspeedway.co.uk. Just to move it out of the fan zone now, Jeff, and maybe get on to some cheerier kind of subjects. We know that was kind of close to your heart. It's obviously a serious subject, but you mentioned there you've been going to Coventry for a long time. When did you start attending, Brandon? And more importantly, you said I think it was 34 years ago you became the photographer there. How did all that come about?
Well, I always went to Speedway. As I say, my parents used to go and took me as a kid, and when I was older, I always wanted to be a Speedway rider. I didn't ever get to be a Speedway rider, but for many years I rode motorcycle trials. Mm-hmm. And when I retired from trials riding, I took up photography, and I started off doing photography at grass track racing. You can get fairly easy access at grass track racing, so I started there. And then one evening when I was at Brandon, I showed Martin Ochiltree. I'm sure people will know the name Ochiltree, the son of promoter Charles Ochiltree. I showed him some pictures I'd taken at grass track, and he asked me would I go and take some at Brandon. And that was 1984, so and I've been there ever since. So that's how it started, yes.
And putting you on the spot here, you listed some of the legends before. If you had to pick one name or one rider overall that you would have as your top rider since you started going, Jeff, who would it be?
Top Coventry rider?
It could be any Coventry or obviously across the gamut of the sport.
Well, I think you'd struggle to look any further than Greg Hancock. He's, an absolute legend. He's an icon of Speedway, and still to be racing at the age of 48, is he now? And still to be at the top level, winning Grand Prix at that age is absolutely incredible. So he's a former Coventry rider. He rode for Coventry for, I think it's about 5 years. Yep. You struggle to look past Greg as being, I would think, the best rider ever.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention one of the nicest guys ever in the history of the sport as well. We had him on our very first episode.
He is a really nice chap. I know him really well. We're very good friends. He's very much like Eric Gunderson. Eric Gunderson is a really, really nice chap. Very, very modest considering his achievements in Speedway. He's another name that obviously springs to mind as one of the best ever. It's a difficult choice, isn't it, to name just one rider? But Greg is amazing and has been amazing. Yeah.
We've seen you put out on your social media recently, Jeff, some iconic pictures, really. Have you got a favourite photograph of your time kind of shooting at Speedway? Is it impossible just to pick one?
It is. I got one that I always really do like, one that I took at Peterborough. Peterborough is an amazing track to get pictures. And it's a good racetrack and very, very good for pictures. And it's one I took many years ago with Alice Drimmel and being chased by Andreas Johnson and Scott Nichols. I've always loved that picture. But when I think about it, the hundreds of thousands, I take now probably, or before this season at least, when I was doing Coventry meetings everywhere and others, I would be taking 90,000 pictures a year. Wow. So I never took that many in the early days when you had to buy rolls of film, but with digital cameras, take an awful, and the technology, my cameras take 14 pictures a second, and it's very, very easy to take 600-700 pictures in an evening. And when I go to Cardiff, I probably take 2,000 pictures, I think, in one evening. So to pick one out of all the hundreds of thousands I've taken is another difficult choice.
I guess the answer to that question in the future hopefully will be Heat 1 whenever the Coventry Bees are back on track in the top league.
Well, that's a very good answer, Scott. Yes, that's one I should have thought of, isn't it? And how we would all love to see that.
We would. It would be fantastic.
Coventry's just been nominated as the City of Culture for 2021, I think it is. Yeah. And we haven't got a Speedway team. The football team hasn't really got a home of its own. But it would be fantastic if we could get Speedway back ideally to Brandon, in the next year or two. It would be fantastic, and I think it would be a sellout. The place would be absolutely packed. Absolutely. Speedway and stock car. We should never forget, by the way, stock car people in all of this. We represent, and our committee has 3 stock car people on it as well, 2 stock car drivers, in fact. Uh-huh. And another chap who's a consultant town planner who's a stock car fan. So they're in the same boat as us. They've lost their sport, the sport they love, and we know that at Brandon, which I didn't appreciate until I got into doing all this, but Brandon was the sort of centre of the stock car world in this country. Really? And always had the biggest crowds, the biggest number of drivers. So they're missing out as well. So it would be fantastic if we could get both sports back to Brandon.
Absolutely. Jeff, throughout this podcast we've heard the kind of passion in your voice, obviously, for Coventry Speedway, and of course your campaign to get the Bees back together. Do you want to just remind everybody, just before we go, your website details and where they can find you guys on social media?
Yeah, we're if they just put into Google or another search engine Save Coventry Speedway, it will come up. We try and keep it up to date and give people as much information as we can without making any false promises and so on, so they can keep up to date on Twitter as well, either my account or Save Coventry Speedway or David Rowe. So there's and also we have an electronic newsletter. We've done a couple of versions of that, and we'll soon do a third one. So if people want to register for that, they can contact us through our website. So please keep in touch with what's going on, and if it's an appropriate time, any of the people listening to this podcast are able to help by, as you mentioned earlier, sending in objections to the development, and then that would be great.
That would be fantastic. Well, as I say, Jeff, we thank you so much for coming on to our third episode of their Featurecast series for this winter. You've been a fantastic guest, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people signing up after listening to this podcast. Of course, if you are listening through, you can listen to the podcast through iTunes. Of course, you can do so as well through SoundCloud and YouTube. We've got a YouTube page, Talk Speedway Podcast on there. And of course, you can listen through our Facebook page as well. Graham, all it's left for us to do now is say good night, and we'll catch you for a Christmas special next week. Good night.
Talk Speedway. Talk Speedway.